My life was anchored in a forgettable, quiet pocket of Blackwood Vale, a town that felt like it had been frozen in time since the mid-80s. Most of the families on my block were legacy residents, people who had owned the same patch of dirt for generations. I was no different. I grew up in that house, eventually inheriting the deed when my parents retired to the coast. I was 3 years into my solo residency when the atmosphere of the neighborhood began to shift. It started in late October. A newcomer pulled a moving truck into the driveway of the weathered colonial directly across from mine. I'm not the type to play the welcome wagon and bake a tray of cookies, but from what I saw while he unloaded his crates, he looked perfectly unremarkable. Just another face in the crowd. A week passed without a whisper, until one evening, I pulled into my driveway after a long shift at the local firm. The man was there. He wasn't walking a dog or checking his mailbox. He was just standing on the sidewalk, his body perfectly still, eyes fixed on my front door. I recognized him instantly as the new guy from across the street. I hit the garage door button, pulled the car in, and hopped out, intending to offer a quick hello and see what he wanted. But in the 20 seconds it took for me to unbuckle and exit the garage, he had vanished. He must have bolted the moment I disappeared from his view. It was strange, deeply strange, but I brushed it off. I had the following day off, so I figured if he really needed something, he'd find his way back. I went about my night, and strangely enough, the encounter slipped my mind almost immediately. The unease didn't return until the sun came up. I stepped out onto the porch to grab the morning paper and instinctively glanced toward his house. It looked dormant. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. But just as I started to turn away, a flash of movement caught the corner of my eye in the second-story window. I did a double take. The glass was empty now, but the blinds were still swaying, vibrating as if someone had just been pressed against them, peering down at me. A cold prickle of sweat broke across my neck. I grabbed the mail and retreated inside. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just admiring the neighborhood layout, but the logic felt thin. I spent the afternoon trying to stay busy, tackling a backlog of housework and losing myself in some mindless streaming. But the sensation was there, heavy and constant, the feeling of a cold pair of eyes on the back of my head. Every 20 minutes I'd find myself creeping toward the window to peek through the slats. Empty street. Every single time. I figured once the sun dipped below the horizon, the weirdness would end. But as the street lamps hummed to life, I took one last look outside. My heart skipped. He was standing at the very edge of my driveway. Something about his posture felt wrong, predatory. I got the sickening impression that he hadn't just arrived there, but had actually been much closer to my house and had retreated to the sidewalk when he heard me moving. Enough was enough. I opened the front door and stepped out into the crisp night air, heading straight for him. I wasn't trying to be aggressive. If anything, I was overcompensating with a forced, nervous friendliness. I just wanted to clear the air. But the second I stepped into his line of sight, he pivoted and started power walking down the pavement, head down, mimicking the gait of someone out for a casual evening stroll. "Hey, excuse me," I called out. Nothing. He didn't even break his stride. I followed him halfway down the drive, calling out again, but he ignored me with a chilling level of commitment. I realized he wasn't going to stop, so I gave up and went back inside, locking the deadbolt behind me. I was officially rattled. I kept running the checklist in my head. A stranger moves in, spends his days staring at my home, and watches me from his window like I'm a specimen under glass. None of it made sense. There was no motive, no history, just a creeping, senseless obsession. I stayed awake for hours, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. I didn't see him again that night, but when I finally climbed into bed, sleep felt like a very dangerous thing to do. Sleep was a shallow, jagged thing. That heavy, oily sensation of being watched followed me into my dreams, refusing to let go. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but I clawed my way back to consciousness in the dead of night, drenched in a cold, sticking sweat. I sat bolt upright, my lungs burning, every nerve ending in my body screaming that something in the house had changed. The silence was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like it's pushing against your eardrums. I was wide awake, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached out and clicked on the bedside lamp, the amber glow carving out a small, shaky sanctuary. Everything looked normal. The shadows didn't move. The air was still. Yet, that visceral, instinctual dread stayed rooted in my gut. It was a physical pressure, a warning not to close my eyes again. I slid out of bed and crept toward the bedroom door. My hand hovered over the lock. Just as I went to turn the deadbolt, a wave of pure, cold intuition hit me. Don't open it. Something told me that turning that lock was the exact mistake I couldn't afford to make. I pulled my hand back, my breath hitching, and pressed my ear against the wood instead. At first, there was nothing. Then, the floorboards in the hallway groaned, soft, rhythmic shifts of weight. It could have been the house settling, but it felt too deliberate. I knelt down, pressing my face toward the narrow gap at the bottom of the door. The hallway was a void of pitch black, and for a few heartbeats, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, something blurred past the gap. I recoiled, scrambling backward while trying to suppress a gasp. The creaking stopped instantly. He heard me. For a second, the silence returned, more terrifying than the noise. Then came the heavy, unmistakable thud of footsteps, not cautious anymore, but bold. They marched right up to the other side of the door and stopped. I was paralyzed, backed up against the side of my bed, my eyes locked on the threshold. The shadows of heavy boots blocked the faint light from the hallway. They shifted, pivoting toward the door. Then, the gap at the bottom went completely black. Something was obstructing it. I leaned in, squinting through the dim light of my lamp. My blood turned to ice. Just inches away, through that tiny sliver of space, a single human eye was staring back at me. He was lying flat on the floor, peering under the door to see where I was. I lunged for my phone on the nightstand. My hands were shaking so violently I fumbled the passcode twice before I could punch in emergency services. Outside the door, the floorboards began to thump and vibrate. He was moving again, pacing or shifting his weight with a frantic energy. By the time the operator told me the units were turning onto Silverwood Lane, the house had fallen silent again. I didn't move. I didn't check the hall. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, terrified he was standing just out of sight, waiting for the door to click open. When the authorities arrived, the house was a tomb. They cleared every room, but he was gone. I wasted no time. I pointed them straight toward the weathered colonial across the street. When they knocked on his door at 2 a.m., he didn't look like a man who had been jolted awake. He was alert, dressed, and agitated. During the questioning, his composure cracked. He slipped up, mentioning a detail about the interior of my house, something he couldn't possibly have known unless he'd been standing inside my hallway. They took him into custody that night. The investigation unearthed a nightmare. He'd been hunting me for weeks before he even signed the lease on that house. His search history was a litany of my name, my routine, and my history. He hadn't just moved into the neighborhood. He had moved there specifically to be within striking distance of me. He had a record, a history of specialized stalking cases that the department took very seriously. He won't be breathing the same air as me for a long time, but the why remains a black hole. We never met. I was a stranger to him, yet he had dismantled his life just to stand outside my bedroom door. I think about that night every time the house settles or a floorboard groans. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't listened to that voice in my head, the one that told me to keep the door locked while he was down there on the floor, looking for me.